Biden sues Texas. The Biden border crisis is now Texas's crisis and America's crisis. And when Texas does something like installing these floating buoys in the river to create a red line of separation between the two nations, the Biden administration doesn't like that. And so they filed a lawsuit. We're going to go through the details of the lawsuit as well as Governor Abbott's response, because he's saying this is our purview now. If you fail to protect our state border, then we have the sovereign right to do it ourselves. But before we go through the details on what Texas is going to do, it sounds like they're digging their heels in and that the lawsuit by the feds are going to have to materialize. They're going to have to file the suit and get a court order to remove this barrier. We'll see where it goes. But this is a nice story about what this barrier looks like. You can see this report came over from ABC, and they've got some nice footage of the barrier.
To bring more witnesses,
overnight, the Department of Justice,
I'll just tell you that the evidence that I've seen is overwhelming.
Suing the state of Texas over these red buoys. The DOJ claiming this 1,000-foot barrier was not approved by the Army Corps of Engineers, now demanding it be removed from the Rio Grande River. But in a letter to President Biden, Governor Greg Abbott doubling down, writing, "Texas will see you in court, Mr. President," and making his case during an interview with Fox News.
Working together, these devices have turned away and repelled tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who try to enter into the United States illegally.
But since the end of Title 42 in May, border crossings have been down more than 30%. The White House responding to Abbott's defiance.
And what you see the governor doing is dangerous and unlawful, and it's actually hurting the process.
The buoy barrier is...
You can see they're pretty big. These two guys are walking around. This is the shallow end of the river, but once they put it out in the middle of the river, kind of going to be hard to get over it or to get under it, right? They're quite big.
Placed in shallow waters, forcing migrants into deep parts of the river, some crawling through razor wire to reach the riverbanks, inflicting injuries on that journey.
You see a war zone. Layers and layers of concertina wire.
Back in Eagle Pass, action can't come fast enough for business owner Jesse Fuentes.
He's has failed to do anything
also
about
suing
it
the state of Texas over this
that.
barrier and the harm it's caused his kayaking business.
It's always
a problem. The border's been a problem my whole life. It will continue to be a problem because both parties are incompetent. But the DOJ said, we don't like that. Texas is doing something that is solving the problem. And so they've decided to strike back, as only the U.S. government can. They file a complaint against the state of Texas for illegally placing the floating buoy barrier in the Rio Grande. This is over from the Office of Public Affairs out of the DOJ, the official government website. And here's what they posted. Now, we're going to take a look at Abbott's response to this. But here is the statement from the Associate Attorney General, Vanita Gupta, who's filing the complaint. He says, "We allege that Texas has flouted federal law by installing a barrier in the Rio Grande without obtaining the required federal authorization." It's like a littering violation. The floating barrier poses threats to navigation and to public safety, and it presents humanitarian concern. Additionally, the presence of the floating barrier has prompted diplomatic protests by Mexico, and it risks damaging U.S. foreign policy. And so they said that as a result, they filed a civil complaint against the state of Texas. The buoy's been strung together, no federal authorization, and they need to do that under the River and Harbors Act. The complaint seeks to enjoin the building of the barrier and requires the state to remove it. And they say this River and Harbors Act is clear. It prohibits the placement of any unauthorized barriers and obstructions in the Rio Grande and other navigable waters, said Assistant Attorney General Todd Kim of the Environmental and Natural Resources Division. And we're going to be seeking appropriate legal remedies, including the removal. He says the Rio Grande is a significant stretch of the southern border of our country. We must recognize that there are laws and policies in place. That's interesting. Should the migrants also recognize that? Should the federal government also recognize that maybe the individual states don't want their borders usurped because it becomes a state problem? Both domestic and international, they say, to ensure safety and security of everyone working, living, and just traveling along the river. These laws cannot be ignored, and the DOJ says, my office will take and support the appropriate legal action to uphold them. The complaint says earlier in the month, Texas directed the creation of the floating barrier, 4 to 6 feet in diameter, strung together 2 miles south of the Camino Real International Bridge in Eagle Pass, Texas. Abbott said, we're going to build more barriers, called it Operation Lone Star, which includes pacing and placing concertina wire near the border. Complaint's been filed. It's going to be litigated by the environmental group. And of course, Texas is not happy about about that. And so Governor Greg Abbott has responded saying, all right, no problem. We'll see you in court. Here's what that letter says. To the Honorable, so-called, Joe Biden, President, allegedly, of the United States, says, Dear President Biden, in a late night letter sent to me by your loser DOJ prosecutors, your lawyers at the Department of Justice threatened to sue the state of Texas over the floating marine barriers we deployed at the Rio Grande and Eagle Pass. Texas will see you in court, Mr. President, in accordance with Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 of the United States Constitution. Governor Abbott says, I have asserted Texas's sovereign interest in protecting her borders. I have done so in my role as the Commander-in-Chief of our state's militia under Article 4, Section 7 of the Texas Constitution. We talk a lot about states' rights and about the states telling the feds to shove it. We saw Missouri, when the ATF was barking at their state laws about gun regulations, they said, get your agents out of our state. Texas is saying, get your federal government out of here. If you're not going to do it, we'll do it under his state sovereign powers. He says that the Constitution forbids, in another case, Biden from bypassing the states and stepping on the governor's shoes. And he says, President Biden, your ongoing violation of Article 4, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution has left me no choice. All of these facts should be familiar to you. They were laid out clearly in a 3-page letter I sent to you back in November. But then on January 2023, I reiterated my point. I hand-delivered another letter to you, Joe Biden doesn't remember this at all, on the El Paso tarmac during a tour of the border disaster that you created. All of this is happening because you have violated your constitutional obligation to defend the United States against invasion through faithful execution of the federal laws. Handed him that letter. He said, this is an ice cream. Gave it to an 8. Instead of belaboring our respective constitutional roles a third time, Joe, I'm enclosing copies of my prior letters to you, in case you need to remember. And so with all that in mind, your lawyers' claim that Texas's floating marine barriers violate Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act, it misses the mark. In the statute, Congress decreed that it shall not be lawful to build any wharf, any pier, any dolphin, boom, weir, breakwater, bulkhead, jetty, or any other structures in any water of the United States. And to state the obvious, Mr. President, the statute does not describe action, any action by the state of Texas. We're doing something different. We're not putting booms or wharfs in, and it's not the waters of the United States. He says, but Texas's action is a side issue. The fact is, Joe, if you would just enforce the immigration laws Congress already has on the books, America would not be suffering from your record-breaking level of illegal immigration. And while I share the humanitarian concerns that your lawyers noted in their letter, Mr. President, your finger points in the wrong direction. Neither of us wants to see another death in the Rio Grande River, but your open border policies encourage migrants to risk their lives by crossing illegally through the water instead of safely and legally at a port of entry. Nobody drowns on a bridge. It has been under your watch, Joe, that migrants have suffered an unprecedented crisis of inhumanity. And this is the same point we've made here. I've lived in Arizona my whole life, and it is horrendous what the incentives do to people. And they sit around and they scream at us like, from New York, AOC, oh, we're humanitarians, we're saving people. And then you see pictures of people stuffing themselves into seats in a car to smuggle themselves in, and people dropping dead, people leaving babies on the side of the border, people cooking to death, stuffed in the back of moving vehicles. It's awful. And they all just sit there and they say, we're saving the world, because they have no connection to reality. They don't even know what they're doing. 2 years before Texas deployed the floating marine barriers and a year before it deployed the concertina wire, a United Nations agency declared the border between U.S. and Mexico the deadliest land crossing in the world. 728 migrant deaths recorded in 2021. Before Texas took the action about which you now complain, hundreds of migrants drowned in the Rio Grande River trying to cross the border illegally. Before Texas took action which you now complain about, 53 migrants who illegally crossed the border died in the back of an 18-wheel tractor trailer near San Antonio. And before Texas took the action about which you now complain, thousands of Americans lost their lives to fentanyl that pours across our border daily. So, Mr. President, if you truly care about human life, you must begin enforcing federal immigration laws. By doing so, you can help me stop migrants from wagering their lives in the waters of the Rio Grande. You can help me save Texans, and indeed all Americans, from deadly drugs like fentanyl, cartel violence, and the horrors of human trafficking. To end the risk that migrants will be harmed crossing the border illegally, you must fully enforce the laws of the United United States that prohibit illegal immigration between ports of entry. In the meantime, Texas will fully utilize its constitutional authority to deal with the crisis that you have caused. Sincerely, Greg Abbott, Governor of Texas. You can see he did include the other letters that he sent over to the president, including the letter that he handed them on the tarmac via hand delivery. So Joe Biden must have forgotten about that one. But of course, if you want to get the full copies of those letters, they are available on the mind map that you can access at robertgovea.com, along with all of the other video files and clips. The DOJ now suing Texas. They are not only incompetent and inept, allowing this catastrophe to continue unabated due to their inaction, but now when other people take action, when other states say, we can't take this anymore, we're going to do something about it, they then use the strong arm of the federal government to bring the boot down upon their neck to get them to stop. But at some point, there is not going to be the federal government capacity to do this. When all of the states, one by one, start telling the feds to get bent, what are they going to do about it? And if Texas digs its heels in and eventually other states join hands and say, we're going to create our own currency, we're going to enforce our gun laws, not yours, we're going to start doing education our way, we're going to start going after our resources our way, we're going to see this great division continue on. Texas might be just the state to lead the charge.